Welcome to the Coaching Revealed podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Austin Matzelle. In this episode of Coaching Revealed, we interview researcher and coach Janine Roberts about her research on emotions in leadership and organizational relationships. Janine traces her path into coaching from organizational transformation work and shares how her research revealed a paradox. Leaders love leadership, yet they often find interpersonal relationships to be their greatest source of stress. Despite decades of emotional intelligence research, many workplaces still suppress emotions and create toxic work cultures. Janine's research indicates that through coaching, leaders gain a safe space for authentic expression and transformational growth. Janine introduces her ACE model. Firstly, attuned. Second, create the conditions. And third, engage and evaluate as a framework for emotional engagement, and describes the practice of emotional contracting to build trust and safety in sessions. She also shares future directions for her work, including turning her research into practical tools for leaders, HR, and coaches, and developing quantitative studies on the effectiveness of emotional engagement strategies. This episode is essential listening for coaches who want to deepen their capacity to hold emotions in the coaching space, leaders who wish to navigate complex workplace dynamics, and anyone curious about the role of emotions as information in professional relationships. And now, our conversation with Janine Roberts. All right. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today for this episode of Coaching Revealed. My name is Austin Matzelle, and I'm very excited to be joined today by Janine Roberts, and we'll go through a little bit of her bio before getting started with our conversation today. So, Janine is the founder of J9 and is fondly known as the Dynamics Doctor, helping leaders and teams navigate complex and emotive relationship dynamics and develop strategies that foster healthier working relationships. Janine possesses extensive expertise in coaching, mentoring, and cultivating high-performing leadership teams. She has worked as a trusted coach, mentor, and board development lead for C-suite executive leaders and teams within a diverse range of public and private sector organizations. These include healthcare, construction, media, legal, charity, education, and SMEs. She holds a doctorate in coaching and mentoring and a master's degree with distinction in behavior change and coaching from Henley Business School. Janine's acclaimed doctorate focused on the impact of coaching on leader emotions in the context of organizational relationship dynamics. Her research has already been granted awards, most recently an Award of Excellence for Research at the Institute of Coaching and the Janice Cook Award from Oxford Brookes Business School. So Janine, it's so wonderful to have you here in conversation today. I would love to just get started with saying hello with you, but also getting to know what first got you into the field of coaching.
Oh, lovely. Thank you so much, Austin. It's an absolute joy and privilege to be on the podcast with you. So what really attracted me to the field of coaching, I guess there's several reasons. One, in the work that I used to do, I was always coaching teams. So when we were actually doing a lot of transformational work, organisational development and large-scale change, a lot of that role was around coaching teams to transform services. So there was always a natural link. And then when I really got into it was because actually it really helped me when I had some one-to-one coaching, and I just found it just really inspirational, but also quite life-changing. So that was kind of my entry into it, and I thought I want to do more of this. So that took me on the journey of doing the Masters in Coaching and really learning much more about it. And what I absolutely loved about it was the difference it can make to people's lives.
That's incredible. And so you have the master's and the doctorate with both these looking kind of at this research focus. I'm curious, how did you get interested in research, and what was kind of maybe the catalyst in wanting to explore emotions?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Where I really came at it from was I was so passionate about leadership. And I guess, and teams, but leaders and teams, resilience and well-being. So I really embarked on this journey. So when I did my master's, my dissertation on the master's was around leaders' resilience. And it's a subject very close to my heart. And what I found was that when I started to then do the proposal for the doctorate, I really wanted to research, how can we help leaders in terms of their resilience and well-being? was actually quite a lot about it, huge amount already written about it. And so I wanted to do something different. And of course, when you do your master's and particularly your doctorate, you have to make a new contribution. So, whether that's a contribution to new theory, new data. And so I was really looking for the nuance of what could I do that was useful and meaningful for leaders and their teams, that would bring a new lens to the work that we do through coaching. And what I discovered was that when you look at actually, well, what are the main factors that drain leaders' resilience, and actually what are the common factors that actually contribute to anxiety, stress, burnout, and ultimately depression. So I looked at resources around the Health and Safety Executive, which is a report we have in the UK, which is around kind of the general state of the workforce, and the international surveys by Gallup and Deloitte looking at the workforce. And what was really interesting was that when you went into that data around some of the really, really important issues that were contributing to stress, anxiety, and burnout was actually relationships, interpersonal relationships at work. And so that for me then was right, this is really interesting. And of course, when you then start to do some of the preliminary research around, what you're going to study, what then emerged was that actually organisational relationships at work are the most frequent cause of intense emotions, both for leaders and followers. But also when I looked at quite a lot of the state of coaching and the reports that came out about coaching and what is it that leaders and clients are bringing to coaching, actually managing relationships and interpersonal relationships or knowing how to lead teams was absolutely right up there as like the third most common objective of leaders seeking coaching. And of course, that's all really emotive stuff. So I got into it because of that.
With your early work looking at and the doctoral research that you were doing, looking at these relationships, what were some of the findings that you got from the data and the work that you were doing? Any surprises there?
One of the things that was really important is I really wanted to hear the voice of the client. In the research, it was absolutely imperative to me that the voice of the people that we are here to serve as coaches was prevalent in the research. And whilst I guess in some respects it's a surprise and in others it isn't, I had the absolute privilege of senior leaders who, from CEOs, vice presidents, people that ran their own organisations, managing partners, you name it, a whole range of industries. So senior leaders from all these different range of industries. And when they came forward to kind of volunteer and participate in the research, it was really interesting. Again, just the intensity of the emotive nature of working with people. But it was kind of a paradox because people were in these positions and a lot of people were in these leadership positions because they really enjoyed leading teams. People love leadership. But at the same time, the most frequent cause of intense emotions was the very nature of the interpersonal relationships and some of the frustrations that can come out of that. So from an emotional perspective, it was the intensity of the emotions and the range of emotions that was experienced by leaders and obviously some of their followers. But it wasn't just that. It was also the fact that, we hear so much about improving the work culture, improving the environment at work and trying to create these psychologically safe places where our employees and people at work can thrive. But what really did startle me was even in leadership positions that many of the leaders were describing cultures at work where emotions were either, it was still the norm to suppress them, and kind of rationale and logic was kind of the supreme source of intelligence at work. And given the amount of work that we've done around emotional intelligence, all of the research that's been around that, you really thought that needle will have shifted. But also what really then quite startled me as well, or was a really, really interesting finding, but was that also leaders were reporting finding themselves in these volatile and often toxic environments and cultures as a result of the way emotions were either suppressed and people were shamed for having them or expressing them. But then with suppression comes emotions have got to go somewhere. And actually, if people aren't working with their emotions in an openly expressive way, then actually that's when you then started to get these volatile and toxic environments because people weren't regulating their emotions. So I think for me, it was still a surprise that there are leaders out there who are reporting that they're operating in these cultures where these emotional climates still exist.
That's such a interesting problem that's emerging as well, when you have all these leaders who they want so badly to work with teams, and they want so badly to be effective in communication, achieve goals together. They love the leadership, they love the team environment, as you're referencing. And then these intense emotions and these small conflicts maybe start snowballing, and a culture emerges, or the leader comes into a company that already has that toxic culture, and their joy or their desire to make a healthy, conducive environment is kind of stifled by the larger company culture that pre-existed them. So within the work that you've done and the research that you've looked at, what are some of the findings, or what are some of the behavior changes that you've seen leaders do that have helped them ground their emotions, or just dig into the relationship in front of them versus that toxic culture that exists around them?
Yeah, and this is why I wanted to look at, when we look at the research question, which is how does coaching influence leaders' emotions in the context of their organisational relationships? What was really interesting and quite powerful was that when you listen to leaders who described their objectives and why they'd gone to coaching and why they'd sought coaching to kind of manage interpersonal relationships and the emotional aspects that came with that, it was really interesting because many of them that participated in the research, they were really cognizant of how important emotions were, and the fact that they were really, they were very much aware of the authentic tightrope that they walk, because they're so concerned about the leadership shadow that they may cast, and how important it was for them to regulate their emotions. But at the same time, again, this paradox of, I want to be authentic, but actually, I'm a human being as well. When we're experiencing conflict or we're experiencing really unhealthy relationship dynamics in the workplace, is where do they go with that? Where have they got a place to go with that? And some of the things that really came out was about how lonely leadership is. And actually, did these leaders have a safe space where they could go and be their authentic self and process their emotions in a way that could help them to regulate them? And so one of the findings that really came out was that what leaders really, really valued was having this safe space where they could be authentically express their emotions with somebody, in a non-judgmental way. And also there was an element of emotional containment as well. That, what coaching was providing was a level of emotional containment that actually stopped them offloading to their partners when they got home, or, stopped them suppressing their emotions, but it enabled them to process them in a way that actually they could deal objectively with what was going in front of them. But the other thing that I think that the research really demonstrated, particularly from the leader's perspective, and I interviewed leaders and coaches, but the leader's voice was really, really kind of prominent here. But what was really interesting was that what leaders described was that when they were in that coaching space and they were experiencing, it could be anything from having to manage major reorganization, massive redundancies or redundancies at scale, to having direct conflict with a business partner or direct conflict with a subordinate, or a leader themselves having direct conflict with another executive or leader on the board that they were in. And what was, there were three things that really emerged from the data. Was that one thing that they found is that when they got into that emotionally engaged space and explored and used their emotions, and they were describing the relationship dynamics that were going on, there were kind of three fundamental steps that kind of happened. One was that the coaching process enabled the leaders to see the actual dynamics or the actual emotional dynamics that were playing out, that enabled them to label it and understand it. So they were able to see deference, if deference was going on. They were able to identify that some of the behaviours were collusion or that they were being undermined. But they were also able to recognise maybe when they themselves had become emotional containers for what was going on in the organisation, and recognised in their own role sometimes how they would act as emotional containers and sometimes slip into the dynamic of the drama triangle, where they were trying to rescue their teams So they were becoming an emotional container, but they were also trying to rescue their teams, which actually was an unhealthy dynamic for themselves, but also for their team. And so the coaching process was quite transformational for them, enabling them to see it and label it, but also to see that what their emotional response to it was. The second step that really then came out was that what the coaching process enabled leaders to do was to actually own their part in it. And what the literature review reveals when we look at neuroscience and evolutionary science, and we look at all of that work around relationships, is when you look at Feldman Barrett's research, who's a neuroscientist, she talks about how emotions are constructed, and emotions are constructed in order to help the brain predict what the most appropriate response is in a situation when our body feels under threat. So, your body's feeling all of these sensations as a result of the relationship dynamics or the emotional climate or the culture that leaders are experiencing. And what it's trying to do is make sense of it and protect and preserve energy. It comes up with these concepts of what it thinks is happening. And sometimes it's right, but sometimes it's also wrong because it might be using past concepts. But also the theory of constructed emotion is what really came out is how emotions are also co-constructed, co-created. When we think about the leader-follower affect or the leadership shadow, actually there's real neuroscience that underpins that, which is that, our emotions affect how other people feel. So whilst people create their own emotions, how we interact with each other affects that. And so the coaching process was really quite enlightening for what leaders said, because it enabled them to see their part in the situation. So not only were they able to see, the patterns and the behaviors of the relationship dynamics that they were experiencing or the system dynamics they were experiencing, they actually were able to take a step back and own it objectively and look at how they were coming to it. But it also gave them an opportunity to own their own emotional response to it. And by the nature of the coaching process, it allowed for their emotions to be contained, for them to process and work through them, but also that provided an element of regulation. And then the final fundamental part that was quite transformational that leaders described was that what it led to was a fundamental shift in mindset and behavior change. The coaching process and engaging with emotions in relation to relationship dynamics enabled leaders to really kind of shift that mindset and realizing actually they've got agency to do something here. They're not quite as powerless as they may have felt when they were embroiled in this relationship dynamic or overwhelmed with the emotional containment that the system was playing at them. And so what it was enabled them to do was really shift their mindset. And they realized, actually, I have some agency. I can do something about this here. But it also enabled them to dial up empathy. Okay, what's going on? What's going on for other people in this situation? What might they be experiencing? What's going on in their emotional ecosystem? And as a result of those three steps, which is kind of seeing it, being able to label it and seeing your own emotional response to it, being able to then own your part and then shifting that mindset through a much more better regulated state and utilizing agency and empathy, they were able to kind of really transform those relationships. And that transformation happened in many different ways, but it just gave them the agency and the empathy and more tools and strategies to transform that relationship dynamic that they were experiencing and really break that cycle, the unhealthy cycle that they'd found themselves in.
We've had Lisa Feldman Barrett within the Institute of Coaching's work in the past, and her work on 7.5 Facts About the Brain. And her work's very incredible. So you have great source material and things to reference within this. That's such an interesting fundamental shift to make sure people, especially in larger team or group capacity, are reaching, which is off of Feldman's work that we have a propensity to become very emotionally active. When we're looking at leaders building up that recognition that we're hardwired to have strong emotions and I'm experiencing that, or someone that I work with is experiencing that, and actually being able to regulate and not elevate to that same level. In the research you've done, if leaders are recognizing or beginning to realize that they're being an emotional container or that they're playing a part in a dynamic, what's that next step for them to try to calm down the elevating dynamic?
Ready to advance your coaching practice? Join the Institute of Coaching and tap into the world's leading resource for coaching science and professional development. With over 4,000 members across 130 countries, the IOC offers invaluable networking opportunities with an elite global coaching community and innovative learning to broaden your knowledge and keep you at the forefront of coaching best practices. Engage in cutting-edge learning events with world-renowned coaching scholars, from webinars and seminars to discussion groups, research projects, and more. Try any membership free for 30 days. Use promo code IOC Podcast and visit instituteofcoaching.org/join to get started.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's lots of things. I think in terms of the next steps for them is, and I love the acronym, which is EASI, EASI, and this is around emotions as social information. And I think, Feldman Barrett's, work was the theoretical underpinnings, certainly in my literature reviewing of the study. And I think we don't embrace it enough in coaching, because I think, in coaching, we're not necessarily utilizing the advancements in neuroscience about how fundamental emotions are in what we do, how we show up, how we make decisions. And so it was really exciting for me to really be able to integrate the latest neuroscience that challenges some of the myths and the barriers around emotions at work. And so in terms of those next steps, and I'll kind of touch on two things. I'll kind of come on to kind of the emotional regulation, or the how we use emotions aspect. But then I'll also talk about kind of those next steps for the individuals and what they do and how they use emotions in the workplace. If we come on to the emotional aspect of it, really, what I found was quite interesting in the research was that, so enabling leaders to connect authentically with how they were feeling. When you got into that emotionally engaged space, what leaders described was that, when coach and leader were working together in that emotional space, they were able to use those emotions to help guide them, to help tell them what might be going on. Equally, to help dispel some of the myths. So what they might actually be feeling emotionally might not actually match the evidence that is in front of them. But it was about using those emotions as information and taking what was useful and meaningful from it in the context of what it was that they had to do. And in that process, and as we've already alluded to, there's a huge level of not just containment, but almost, just almost that being able to hold that space for a leader to just do that authentic emotional expression. And it's a real privilege as coaches to be able to hold that space. And then in terms of what the next steps are for the leader, what really came out of the research was that there were different sides, and it's not as binary as two sides. There were those leaders that absolutely felt, and really believed in the power of emotions and recognized how important they were for emotional connection as a leader with their peers, with their followers. But they were also interesting from the coach's perspective, where they described scenarios where working with leaders who were not necessarily in touch with their emotionality and working with this myth that, there isn't a place for emotions at work, or just not really being aware or cognizant of, how important emotions were in how they connected with others and how their own workforce were possibly trying to connect to them in a way. But actually, if these leaders were so task focused and not able to connect at an emotional level, the impact that had. So some of the next steps for the leaders was very much around actually really understanding what your own emotional needs were as a leader, because just because you're a leader doesn't mean say you don't have emotional needs. So what are your emotional needs, and how do you get them met through the complexity of the work that you do in leading teams, in leading others, and in the context of all these system pressures that you are dealing with in trying to drive your teams. So looking after the self and meeting your own emotional needs was really important. But it then was it was really powerful, because we asked them, what do you think coaching can do to support leaders? And it's really interesting, because they still kind of said, we need to talk more about emotions at work. Coaches can help us with our teams, with our leaders, to really embrace the value that emotions bring into our workspace and how we use them openly and constructively. And so we move away from these emotional climates, where we're suppressing emotions or we're shaming people for being emotional. Because if we do that, then actually emotions are going to come out anyway. And that's when we then experience the volatility and the toxicity, because these emotions are so unregulated. How do they, and we as coaches, help them get to use emotions and, work with them as normal parts of the system pressures and how people are working, and tapping into them and so what's going on for somebody at the moment? How are you feeling? Because that was a real shift for people, which was actually what I've been doing in my coaching space in terms of exploring and using emotions. I'm actually now doing in my leadership.
What I'm really curious about here is that coaching space and the space that coaches are building, maybe, specifically to help the leaders that they're working with build their capacity for emotional engagement. You're a coach listening to this and you're wondering, you work with a leader who is in a high stress, high pressure environment, who has emotional volatility in their workplace. What types of things should you as a coach be thinking about as you create this container and this safe space for this leader to experience their emotions and begin processing through a better way for their organization to be working?
I think first of all, as a coach, and it's interesting because one of the things that emerged from the research was the concept of emotional contracting. So you're not, as a coach, you're not wading in and right, how are you feeling, etc. And what really emerged was this beautiful process of emotional contracting. So coaches that were really comfortable, confident and capable of working with emotions in that space. They did this, they did what I've kind of termed emotional contracting. And emotional contracting is beyond, the kind of the formalities of contracting around, what are your goals, what are your objectives, how many sessions are we going to have, and our rules of engagement. And the emotional contracting was very much around, how do we want to work together? How can I partner with you in this? But the emotional contract, it came out and it emerged that coaches would work and when they could see that they were getting into really emotional or emotive territory, they do this really lovely, flowing, kind of symbiotic process of contracting, where they would contract with the leader. Is that an area that we need to go into? Do you want to talk about how you're feeling there and what's behind those feelings? And we're not talking about going into a deep therapeutic session. And it was really interesting because the leaders that came, and when we talk about the different levels of emotional engagement and coaching, when leaders were dealing with this stuff, they said, coming at me with a grow model, or coming at me with solution focused coaching, and coming at me with a process when I'm dealing with this really emotive stuff is not going to help me. So what they were saying is they needed that space to process their emotions. But what I really liked seeing with some of the coaches was that they would do that emotional contracting with them. So where do we need to be? And what came out of the research was the ACE model, which was the fundamentals of emotional engagement. And A was about being attuned. So as a coach, how attuned are we to the emotional state of our clients that we're working with? And how do we adapt our approach to what they need? So being attuned and being able to adapt our approach was really important. And kind of the C was around creating the conditions for the leaders to express their emotions in an authentic way. And part of creating the conditions for them to feel like they've got a safe space and that they wouldn't be judged, and that they could express their emotions authentically was also part of that contracting. So is this an area that is going to be useful to you? Should we explore? You talk about how you're feeling, what might be behind that. And they all did it in very different ways, but they really engaged with and kind of partnered with the leaders in terms of where they wanted to go. So they always made sure that the leader was in control of what they wanted to discuss, how they wanted to discuss it, and how much they talked about their emotions. And then the E in the ACE model was about evaluating that. So you would explore those, but then you would kind of sense back, and coaches would come back and sense check and evaluate. Is this where we want to go? Is this where you want to go? Is this useful for you? And evaluate it. And that doesn't mean to say that, emotionally engaged coaches stayed there in that emotional space. They just might stay there for the period of time that it was emotive. And then they kind of maybe move out of that space and kind of go into, so what's this telling you? What do we need to do? What do you need? What's most useful and meaningful for you to move on to?
The ACE model, to me, also, I'm seeing with it, that seems very, very powerful, is there's this element of just awareness and grounding yourself in the present moment. And then this slight ability to experiment with emotions, which maybe you haven't had the ability to do too much, but giving a safe space for it, and then checking in afterwards to see how was that.
The evaluation and checking in was really important, because what the research found was that there were varying levels of emotional engagement. So in terms of the way that coaches worked with leaders, and this was reported from both sides, from both the leaders and the coaches' data, what emerged was 4 levels of emotional engagement. And the levels of emotional engagement that you attained in coaching with your client was as a result of the conditions that you created. And it was also based on how much the leader wanted to engage at an emotional level, but also the coach is willing to engage and their skills and abilities in being able to engage in comfort and confidence. One of the levels, which is around exploring, because some coaches describe leaders where actually they may have come into the process quite emotionally avoidant. So I coined the term emotionally avoidant, and that was not saying that they didn't ever want to engage, but in that moment, in that time, in that process, you might have leaders and coaches that come at it and they just stay process, they stay task and solution or model focused. What really surprised me in the data was actually, of course, there's real value in that. There was real value in it. So that's not to say not emotionally engaged coaching doesn't yield results or value, because actually the research findings found that actually process-focused coaching still added value. It was still transformational. But what I found was the real work, the real transformation and the real emotional growth really happened when coaches and leaders engaged either at what we called exploring emotions, so engaging with emotions from an exploratory perspective. And that might be where actually there might be some hesitation or, I'm not quite sure this is a space I want to get into. The coaches were able to create the conditions where both leader and coach were able to explore emotions and explore working with emotions. So that was another level. And then, of course, you had it where basically, coach and leader were very much wanting to get into that emotionally engaged space where they worked with emotions, they used the emotions, they labelled the emotions and they explored them. They put emotions in their place in the context of the situation that was going on. All those 3 levels revealed positive results. But the truly transformational results really came when coach and leader engaged either at the exploring emotions or fully emotionally engaged. That's where the real transformation happened. But there was another level, and it was about emotionally misaligned. This is why I think the emotional contracting kind of played out, even though it was kind of a symbiotic process. And the misalignment happened when, if you had a leader that came to coaching that really wanted to explore emotions or get into, working with their emotions and wanting to articulate and understand their emotions, but the coach was staying process focused or models based, actually it devalued the coaching relationship and the coaching process, because the leaders come into this with, this is what's going on for me, this is really emotive, and I need to be able to be my authentic self here in a non-judgmental space. And what they said was that it felt very process orientated and very impersonal when they were being coached by somebody that was sticking to the grow model on me. That's not going to help me with this situation. At the same time, the other thing could also happen, and leaders reported, which is where a leader may have come and actually wanted to stay in that solution focused or process focused. If the coach came in and started wading into emotions without some kind of, well, where are you? Without some kind of emotional contracting, again, it kind of pushed them apart. So what was revealed through the research were these 4 levels of emotional engagement: emotionally misaligned, emotionally avoidant, in that both coach and leader stayed in the emotionally avoidant process focused space, of which there was still value and there was still results. But then there was exploring emotions curiously. And then there was emotionally engaged, which is where both parties had, they'd consented and they were going to really get into the mix of what their emotions were telling them and how to use that in order to help them to see what was going on in the relationship dynamics.
There's so much going on here with the optimal dynamics, such as emotional engagement. When you have your coach and the client working together and they're aligned, versus you mentioned the emotional misalignment. So whether the coach is not wanting to touch on emotions and the client is, or the client is not wanting to touch on emotions, but the coach is. As you've brought up the emotional contracting, what is an effective way for coaches to be presenting an emotional contracting moment in a client session, how would you advise a practitioner to set up an emotional contract during a coaching session?
I think I'm not going to avoid that question, but I think it's a difficult one to answer, because I think if I describe that, it becomes very transactional. That wasn't what was happening in that space. And I think it's about coaches and leaders together finding out what it is they want to work on and how they do that together in partnership. And I think that was the fundamental thing. What I would suggest to coaches is that think about your own, how do you feel about engaging with your clients' emotions? And what might that tell you about you and your relationships or your attitude and beliefs towards emotions in coaching? Because I was very struck by, in the literature review, there was very, very little research. And my research still showed that there is still this variation in attitudes, beliefs, skills and confidence of coaches towards engaging with emotions in coaching. So I think it's less about me advising somebody. I think what I would really say and what really came out of the research is you have to question and explore. If you're going to be exploring your client's emotions, how are you exploring your own so that you can be in service of your clients when you are doing deep emotional work in relation to organizational relationships? When you get into that emotive, and particularly with team and group coaching, and there's some research on this, is that then when you're presented with somebody that's being emotional, what are you noticing about you? What's happening to you? Are you fearing it? Are you wanting to pull away from it? Are you really leaning into it? Where are you on that? And what does that tell you about you? And do have people that have different levels of engagement. And I think it's quite healthy for us, if we start to get into that emotive territory. What leaders and coaches described was that, as I said earlier, if somebody was really upset, how do you hold that space for them to be upset? Or are you the person that wants to rush in and go, I'm going to get you some tissues, or I'm really sorry to hear that, and you start to fill that space? How do you know that you are meeting their needs in that moment? I would always say you have to do your own emotional work as a coach. You have to lean into your own emotionality. And think about what your relationship is for emotions if you're going to enter that space and hold that space for others. Equally, I think you have to respect if people don't want to go there. And of course, ethics and duty of care and boundaries comes into it. We're talking about a phenomena here, which is about organizational relationships, which happens in everyday interactions, in interpersonal skills. And as coaches, we need to be equipped to support our leaders and our teams to operate in that space. So we need to get into the emotional work that happens in teams and happens in interpersonal relationships. The key skill is how we do it. And again, I think coming back to the ACE model, the fundamentals of emotional engagement that came out were being attuned to your own emotional response, but what's happening to your client, and being able to adapt your response. So if they want to engage at an emotional level, can you go there? Equally, if they don't, then respect that and kind of think about what is it that they need. Cultivating that safe space for your leaders and your clients to do the work that they need to do without judgment. That goes across all of the coaching. But I think the E, exploring, but also evaluating. And I'm always minded of quite a few stories where some of the coaches described how often they'd start a coaching relationship with leaders who absolutely wanted to stay in that process-focused space. They did not want to engage at an emotional level. But over time, because the coaches had created that space for them to be their authentic self in a non-judgmental way, and they started to then explore emotions, that actually over time, they were able to engage at an emotional level and do some quite transformational work. The ACE model that really came out of the research was around whenever you are presented with somebody that's coming, at you and they're highly stressed, I guess the key thing is not backing away from it. It's actually leaning into it, but contracting with your leader what is useful and meaningful for them to do in that moment, and how we can hold that space for them to do their best thinking, to do their best work, but enabling them to process it. And in that processing, actually, there is a level of regulation and co-regulation that occurs in that. But really kind of being attuned to that was fundamental in helping leaders to kind of work through and process their emotions.
That is incredible. It definitely makes sense that the answer to kind of a question of what is the structure you could put onto any relationship is that there's so challenging to put a structure on any type of relational dynamic. It's really about presencing in that moment and seeing as a coach what your client is requesting or needing.
Absolutely. And the other thing that also, and I should have said this, in terms of when we look at the heart of all of this, right at the heart of all your contracting, and when you are working with your client and they're talking about the emotionals and the emotional dynamics they're experiencing in their relationships, I always talk about what's going on in people's emotional ecosystems. And what I mean by the emotional ecosystem is that your clients will present not just with the problem that they're presenting, but there's a whole range of things that's going on in their emotional landscape. There is the culture that they're involved in. There is the emotional climate. There are the actual relationships and the relationship dynamics that they are experiencing. But that's only part of it. You then have these interpersonal differences, which is, well, how does this person operate? But also within their emotional landscape is what's going on for them at home? What's going on for them within their family? When you are dealing with somebody's emotions that are present, you're not just dealing with the emotions that are showing up in that relationship, you're also dealing with their emotional ecosystem. And the other thing that also is into play is when coaches get into this emotionally engaged space in relation to organizational relationships, being systemically attuned, so using things like constellations, is so powerful. Because when you're dialing up the empathy, if you look at it as a system and you look at the people and the relationships that are in the system, being able to see those perspectives from other parts of the system and other lenses in the system. So taking and being systemically attuned was something that the leaders found incredibly valuable, which really then enhanced the emotional engagement and the connection.
I can only imagine how powerful that is and how seen and witnessed a human would be experiencing that level of care for how they're doing and how they're doing within that broader system. It's starting to get us wound up with the end of this interview. You have your research and your work within the space of emotional engagement. We had your research report that won an award at our last conference in 2024 with Coaching with the Heart in Mind. Where is your research heading now? What questions are you thinking about exploring?
Yeah, there's just so much to explore. So at the moment, where the research is at the moment is we've been able to convert it. So I'm a researcher practitioner. So the thing for me is being able to take this research into practice. One of the things that's really come out of it is that, 22, and there's loads more, but 22 different types of system and emotional dynamics came out of this research. And what we've been able to do is now translate the strategies that were being used in the coaching space that achieve these transformational results. So what we're doing at the moment is turning that into practical, meaningful, useful tools that leaders, HR directors, OD professionals can use in the interpersonal relationship space. And so what we're doing at the moment is converting the research into real practical strategies that people can use. And so we're kind of taking that to a whole range of organizations, conferences, and we've been able to take it across Europe. There's lots of teams now that are really embraced with that and using it. So that's really, really exciting. The research is being converted into a book. There's 2 books, really. The first book is very much for the leaders or teams. So turning it again into actually how can you use this at work? So how can you identify these dynamics? So it's about really converting the SOS framework, the see it, the own it, shift it into meaningful tools and strategies that anybody can use that's involved in interpersonal relationships. And the other book, which is Coaching with the Heart in Mind for coaches, which is what are the strategies? Because there was a whole range of strategies that coaches used to get into that emotionally engaged dialogue, so there was a whole range of tools. And so hopefully we'll be converting that into a book once we've done the one that actually will get out there to leaders and teams and followers. But in terms of ongoing research questions, I would love to see a real quantitative piece on, given that we are seeing this, exponential increase in coaches being trained, how are we training coaches? How are we educating them about the psychological and neuroscientific dimensions of emotions in leadership, in coaching, and how we work with it? I'd love to see kind of the ACE model, the fundamentals of emotional engagement. It would be great to see if somebody wants to do a quantitative piece on that to say, if we do coach like this, what impact is that having? Because we've seen the qualitative version. We've seen the version that brings it alive. But actually, what about an alternative study that actually then turns that into some meaningful data?
We'll leave that one to our listeners. Hopefully one of you out there wants to get started on that next piece of data for this work in the study. How can people stay in contact with you? How can they reach you, see about the books that are upcoming and the research and work you're doing?
Yeah, it's a great question. So please, I guess the easiest way is LinkedIn. Please just connect with me on LinkedIn if you're really interested in this subject. And equally, if you've got challenging views or different views and perspective, because they all matter, because we've all got different ways of working. We've all got different ways of engaging. I'm just sharing with you what came out of the research. But also, if you want to become a beta reader for the forthcoming book, again, contact me on LinkedIn, because what I'm hoping to do now is to start a live LinkedIn campaign as well, which is where I'll start to share some of the content, because I think it's so important that some of these strategies get out there that help people, help coaches and leaders and teams. So the sooner that we can kind of not just drip feed, but get this information out there and the different strategies, I think, we can help a lot more teams who might be in distress, or leaders that might be in distress.
Absolutely. And Janine, thank you so much for coming onto the podcast today. It's been a wonderful experience getting to talk with you today.
It's been a great privilege, and I absolutely love the work the Institute of Coaching does.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And thank you all for listening. We'll be back with the next episode of Coaching Revealed.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Coaching Revealed, brought to you by the Institute of Coaching. You can learn more about the Institute on our website at instituteofcoaching.org. You can stay up to date with new episodes of our podcast by liking and following Coaching Revealed. You can also find us on social media on LinkedIn, Instagram, and X with the handle Institute of Coaching. We also love hearing from our guests, so please reach out to us with thoughts you have on this episode and any questions you have about coaching. Until next time, this is Emily Tarani with Coaching Revealed.